I grew up hearing stories from the pages of the Bible. But did they really happen? This question led me to the ancient lands of the Middle East, searching for patterns of evidence that match the biblical events. I wasn't prepared for what would be revealed. The initial goal of my investigation was to find evidence showing that Moses could have written the book of Exodus as an eyewitness account. Because if he did, then the directions for the Israelites' journey and the location of Mount Sinai could be verifiable, something most scholars doubt. The first breakthrough was the mysterious script found by Egyptologists Flinders and Hilda Petrie in the mines of the Sinai Peninsula. The kind of writing used in these inscriptions became known as Proto-Sinaitic and also as Proto-Canaanite. This script would have provided a tool that Moses could have used to write the first books of the Bible. But this leads to a new question. Could this script actually be the earliest form of written Hebrew? Because the Israelites, who were Hebrew people, were the writers of the Bible, and all Torah scrolls that have ever been found were written with a Hebrew alphabet. This might seem like a logical question, but I was very puzzled to find just how controversial this idea is in the world of academia today. I went to Israel to meet with the chair of Egyptology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Professor Orly Goldwasser is one of Israel's leading experts on the formation of the early alphabet. There are some people that are suggesting that this Proto-Sinaitic script was early form of Hebrew. Have you ever heard that before?
Yeah. This is sad.
Sad. This is sad. Yeah.
It's not science. I mean, this is, excuse me for using the very blunt words here, this is disseminating fake knowledge and fake science to people. It's not their field. You can tell me, for example, any stories in biology, mathematics, and I will believe because I don't know.
Yeah.
And really, if my great teachers, Joseph Nové, would be alive, I think he would die again if he would hear.
If you'd hear that?
This theory. I mean, it has nothing to do, you see, Hebrew is a kind of dialect that developed, Canaanite dialect, that developed much later.
Mm-hmm.
So to call this old Canaanite dialect, which cannot be identified really because the inscriptions are too short,
yeah.
Hebrew, it's opportunism.
Professor Gentry experienced something different with his professors.
Frequently, when we're taught things, there's a consensus among scholars that this is the way things are, but when you get out the microscope and examine the evidence, sometimes it doesn't add up, and so it's important to be able to check things out.
Yeah, because I know that a lot of people can say, well, my professor told me.
Yeah, that's right.
And then his professor told him, correct?
That's right.
But then there's the real question of, well, is it correct?
That's right.
Well, what would be one example of a problem that you had that through diligence and investigation you were able to solve for yourself?
Well, I think the documentary hypothesis is one. I went to a school where they taught it every day for 17 years. I read a book by an Italian Jew called Umberto Cassuto. He wrote a very good book criticizing the documentary hypothesis, and so one day I was at the University of Toronto, and my professor was teaching the documentary hypothesis, and all I did was very politely say, well, have you ever looked at the book by Umberto Cassuto? And the answer I was given was, well, you know, you don't read books like that around here. So that was when I clued in and realized, well, you know, for them it's a faith stance. It's not as if, you know, this is perfect science.
Right. In other words, there was a sense that they didn't want to hear other information.
That's right. For me, they were the fundamentalists because their minds were closed and they were not interested in evidence that would call their consensus into question.
The issue of this script being Hebrew directly connects to whether Moses could have used it to write the Torah. And if one believes that Moses didn't write the Torah, then where does that thinking naturally lead? We both grew up in families that believe the Bible
Absolutely.
was a historical document.
Right. My father was a minister, very conservative, southern, small-town churches.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about that. You were raised in a conservative
we
home.
read the Bible literally and thought that was adequate.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went to a Bible college and nothing changed there. Then I went to a liberal Protestant theological seminary, and that was quite a shock, I remember. And then I went on to Harvard, and by that time I was moving away from theology and into history, and thus into archaeology.
Mm-hmm. You were actually a minister.
I was the clergyman for 13 years, United Church of Christ.
I'm going to ask you a theological question.
Yeah.
Because you have had quite an arc of a life.
I've had an adventuresome life.
You have, you have. So I'm going to ask you just the most obvious question. Is there a God?
I am not an atheist. I think that's an arrogant position. I'm an agnostic, which means I do not know. And I think that's the only honest position I can take. I'm not going to say there is or there is not. That's a theological issue. I'm not a theologian.
In these interviews, it was clear to me that the more these scholars doubted that Moses wrote the Torah, the less sure they were of even the existence of God. I remember going to church on Sunday mornings and hearing the Bible called the Word of God. I was taught that Moses and other biblical writers were divinely inspired. They were chosen people who wrote what they saw and heard from God, so others in the future could read it. Was there a connection between the Bible and the world's first alphabet? Early in his career, David Rohl had uncovered problems with the dates given to the reigns of Egyptian pharaohs. He concluded that Egypt's dating had been over-exaggerated and needed to be revised. When this was done, he began to see evidence for the biblical Exodus emerging in an entirely new period. While most scholars put the 6 steps of the Exodus in Egypt's New Kingdom, this evidence was in the earlier Middle Kingdom, at a time where most weren't looking. The unexpected result of David's revision of Egyptian history was that the early evidence shifted forward, aligning with the biblical dates. To further explore his theories, he traveled into the Sinai area, where the Petries made their discoveries. He had quickly come to realize that placing the early Israelites in the Middle Kingdom could connect them and their Hebrew language with the Proto-Sinaitic script, which was invented in the same time period and in the same area. And David was convinced he knew who was responsible for inventing it.
Hebrew is one of the family of Northwest Semitic languages.
So it's part of the same family.
Yes.
What does this say about the alphabet then?
It tells us that somebody, a Hebrew or an Israelite, at some point earlier than this, because we know these inscriptions date to the late 12th dynasty as well as this period, some genius invented this series of letters that form an alphabet. It's the first alphabet ever invented by human beings. It's developed out of Egyptian hieroglyphs, and it is the ancestor to all our modern alphabets.
And all this started showing up in the Sinai Peninsula.
Yes, and it's carved in solid rock.
If it turns out that this script represents an early form of Hebrew, that would be astounding. Not only would it be case closed for Moses' ability to write the Torah in Hebrew, it would also match the Bible's story of Hebrew-speaking Israelites living in Sinai and Egypt at the same time as the pattern of evidence puts them there. But the idea of Moses writing the Torah and a biblical exodus is inconceivable to most scholars. Yet, I had been faced with this challenge before, and the solution was found in a pattern. In the search for whether the Sinai inscriptions were actually written in an early form of Hebrew, I would need to answer the following 3 questions. Do the letters of the Proto-Sinaitic script match the look of Hebrew? Is there a connection? And are the inscriptions readable as Hebrew? Do they make sense? And does the history of the early alphabet match the history of the Israelites? Because if it does, it would indicate they were the ones responsible for it. So the first question of the Hebrew pattern is, do the letters of the Proto-Sinaitic script match the look of Hebrew? Dr. Douglas Petrovich has long studied inscriptions and their meanings. He is yet another scholar I met who believes Moses wrote the Torah. It appears that Professor Deaver's claim that scholars no longer hold this view was overstated. Just like David Rohl, Dr. Petrovich proposes that the early Sinaitic script is actually the earliest form of written Hebrew, developed by the Israelites. However, unlike Rohl, Petrovich doesn't see a problem with Egypt's dating system, so he uses the standard dates. Petrovich recently outlined his case in his book, The World's Oldest Alphabet. He thinks a key link between the Sinai inscriptions and the early Israelites is the fact that whoever invented the alphabet borrowed symbols from Egyptian hieroglyphs to make the letters. So here's the Egyptian gallery, and we have an artifact here. Tell me about this.
That's right. This is from ancient Egypt. It's from the Old Kingdom, maybe about 400 years before Abraham lived.
It's very old then.
It's very old.
So what is the connection with Egyptian hieroglyphs and the oldest alphabet?
Well, this is the very writing script that's the basis of the world's oldest alphabet. They were formed from 22 of these hieroglyphic signs.
Are there any of those examples here on this?
Yes. In fact, here's a wave of water. When you convert this into a proto-consonantal alphabetical letter in Hebrew, this becomes the M, because for Hebrews, water is mayim. So they see the wave of water, they're thinking mayim, and they pronounce M.
So this is where the alphabet came from. But how did it develop over time? When you look at the family tree for the beginning of the alphabet, it starts with the Proto-Sinaitic script, which when found in Canaan is called Proto-Canaanite. Then, in the standard view, the alphabet is believed to have developed into Phoenician hundreds of years later. In this view, Phoenician branches into other scripts such as Old Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, continuing on to numerous alphabets over the centuries. But was the first alphabet related to Hebrew? Professor Petrovich has argued that the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions were actually an early form of Hebrew and the world's first alphabet. What are your thoughts?
I wish that it were true. I wish that that were correct. It would be absolutely fascinating. The difficulty with that is, first and foremost, the script of the Proto-Canaanite inscriptions or the early alphabetic inscriptions. The script is definitely not the Hebrew script, so that's a problem.
I could see why it's difficult to link Old Hebrew with the world's oldest alphabet, the Proto-Sinaitic script. Old Hebrew, or Paleo-Hebrew as it's sometimes called, is thought to have emerged 1,000 years later and to have developed from Phoenician. And the consensus of scholars holds that the very first Hebrew text starts with Old Hebrew by definition.
We know the Hebrew inscriptions well, we know the Hebrew script well, beginning around 900 BCE. And the script of those inscriptions is dramatically different from the Hebrew script, dramatically different.
However, scripts can look dramatically different and still be a part of the same family. One example can be seen by looking at the first verse in the book of Genesis, as seen in the Wycliffe Bible. It was written in the English of 1385, from about 600 years ago. Here is the same verse today. I was surprised how much English has changed. Furthermore, even Professor Rolston acknowledged that the Hebrew script changed over time in a later period.
The script certainly evolved during the course of time, but its evolution begins around 900 BCE.
But if Old Hebrew evolved over time, why couldn't it have evolved earlier, from the script that is known today as Proto-Sinaitic? I needed to go back to Israel and to the important biblical city of Gezer, 20 miles northwest of Jerusalem. It was here that Irish archaeologist Stuart McAllister discovered what many consider to be one of the earliest Old Hebrew inscriptions found to date. It was a calendar inscribed on a limestone tablet that included monthly information about crops. I looked at the Gezer calendar to compare to the inscriptions the Petries discovered in the Sinai mines, which are from centuries earlier. For many of the letters, you can see a clear resemblance. Some of the letters of the two scripts are also different, but according to Doug Petrovich, they aren't as different as Professor Rolston claims. He showed me how each letter changed over time, starting with the fifth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the letter He.
It starts out as a full man, here, here, and here. Usually, he has both arms up with right angles at his elbows in a pose that we who live in the United States would call the touchdown pose.
Yeah, right.
So this is the touchdown letter. This letter makes the H sound in Hebrew, like H. And it comes from the Hebrew word halal. That's the word that's connected to the pictograph.
Okay.
Halal means praise.
Or hallelujah.
The word hallelujah is based on this very word.
Okay.
It's the arms raised in praise toward God. So the head is insignificant. The legs are insignificant. Oddly enough, what happens over time? As the letter evolves, here's one leg missing. Here's a head that's been reduced greatly, reduced greatly, reduced greatly. No legs at all here on Sinai 374. Why? Because all you need is the hands raised. So eventually, they realized we don't really need the head and we don't really need the legs. So that morphs into what looks like an E. And if you were to take this from the Tsarta Astrakhan and turn it 90 degrees to the left, it would be the neck of a person, the left arm of a person, and the right arm of a person, all pointing up.
So while the Proto-Sinaitic letter of a man praising may look quite different than the corresponding Old Hebrew letter, once you understand how it developed, you can see how they relate. David Rowe also showed me how this development happened with our modern letter A.
I'll give you a good example. The bull's head, Aleph, it starts life as an ordinary drawing of a bull with two horns. And as it comes through Proto-Canaanite into Phoenician, it turns to that shape at right angles from the original bull, and it's now become lines rather than a very, very careful drawing. It's very angularized. And then it comes into Greek and to our English language like this. So it's rotating and it's changing its shape, but you can still see the original bull's head in the letter A, but it's now upside down.
But can these two related scripts be considered different versions of Hebrew? It appears that Phoenician is the one thing standing in the way of making that link. So how dramatic are the differences between Old Hebrew and Phoenician? When compared to Phoenician, the character of the letters looks very similar to the Old Hebrew found by Stuart McAllister, to the point where most of the letters are basically identical. It could almost boil down to individual styles of handwriting. Israel's preeminent authority on ancient inscriptions was the late Joseph Neve. Dr. Goldwasser was one of Neve's students.
He was the great expert of the script.
Because I want to find out what the truth is, because I've interviewed some people who are saying they think there's a link. I know that Joseph Neve, he said something, he wrote in inscriptions of the 10th century.
10th century, remember that?
Yeah.
In inscriptions of the 10th century, Phoenician, Hebrew, and Aramaic scripts are indistinguishable.
If Old Hebrew, Aramaic, and Phoenician were indistinguishable in the 10th century, is it really proper to call the script Phoenician at that time? According to Neve, it's only later that this script branches into the more distinct versions. In that case, the actual model for the early alphabet would look more like this, with this mystery script being the predecessor of the other three. Today, some call this mystery script Early Phoenician. Others call it a late form of Proto-Canaanite. But could it actually be an early form of Hebrew? To be clear, Joseph Neve held to the same standard view as Professors Rolston and Goldwasser, that we can't call the early phase of this script Hebrew, because Old Hebrew did not become a distinct script until after the 10th century BC.
This is worse for your theory.
Yeah.
Because Neve believes that the Hebrew was born even later.
Okay, so what is called Old Hebrew came later. But the question remains, what really was this mystery script? Professor Neve did an extensive study of 6 letters from this script as it evolved into Phoenician, Old Hebrew, and Aramaic. And surprisingly, he said that over time, the Hebrew script preserved the basic forms of the letters to a greater extent than the other 2. Now that is curious. Why would Old Hebrew be the one to maintain the characteristics of the mystery script better than the others? Neve believed it was because the Israelites were isolated in a mountainous land, steeped in tradition, so they didn't change things. But if Old Hebrew is the most similar to the mystery script, maybe it's because both were forms of Hebrew. Based on the thinking of scholars like Petrovich and Roll, this opens up the possibility that Proto-Sinaitic was merely Hebrew 1.0, as the earliest form of written Hebrew, that later developed into Hebrew 2.0, the mystery script. It was then picked up by Israel's neighbors, the Phoenicians, before spreading throughout the region. It would later develop into Old Hebrew, or Hebrew 3.0. Interestingly, the idea that some form of Hebrew writing came first is supported by one of the earliest Jewish historians. Eupolemus, around 150 BC, wrote in his book titled On the Kings of Judea.
Moses was the first wise man, and the first that imparted grammar to the Jews. The Phoenicians received it from the Jews, and the Greeks from the Phoenicians.
For Roll and Petrovich, Moses was the wise man who had the ability to write the book of Exodus as an eyewitness account. When investigating the first step, does Proto-Sinaitic match the look of Hebrew, I discovered that there are many letters in Proto-Sinaitic that closely resemble those of the mystery script in Old Hebrew. The development of those letters that are different can be traced in a logical way, showing that these scripts are related. Over time, as the script transitioned to the distinct Phoenician, Aramaic, and Old Hebrew styles, it was the Old Hebrew that maintained the style of the mystery script better than the others. This supports the idea that the original Proto-Sinaitic was Hebrew 1.0, which then evolved into Hebrew 2.0 and 3.0. I can now move on to the second step of the pattern, investigating whether the inscriptions are readable as Hebrew, an idea that is extremely controversial. Rolston says that the words found in the inscriptions are not specific to Hebrew, but are common to all Semitic languages.
In other words, it's not evidence for those texts being Hebrew. It's evidence for those texts being Semitic, and that's all that we can say.
But if all the Semitic languages are so similar, then doesn't that also mean that we can't really say that it isn't Hebrew? Obviously, some Semitic group invented the first alphabet. And why not the Israelites? And for more than 100 years, other scholars have suspected the Hebrew connection, but their ideas never took hold. David Roll has worked with the Sinai inscriptions and disagrees with Rolston's position. He believes they can be read as uniquely Hebrew. Roll used recognized letter identifications made by previous scholars for the signs. He then sent those letter interpretations to Rabbi Michael Shlomo Baran in Jerusalem to see if the inscriptions could be read as biblical Hebrew.
One day, David Roll just sends me an email with a string of letter names, and I scratch out this string of letters and the modern Hebrew characters that we make use of, and I look at it for a minute, and I clearly make out what the word roots are, and I'm blown away. I can read it. In other words, this is not this Northwest Semitic that you're talking about. This is the Hebrew of our ancestors. This etching, this inscription somewhere in the Sinai desert is actual plain biblical Hebrew.
What were some of the things that were written there?
Well, there are things like instructions how to use manna. You know that in the Bible there's a big thing about, you mustn't store it. You have to eat it when it's given to you. And this thing says, pay attention to the way you use manna. Follow the Father and his instructions.
Dr. Petrovich also agrees that these inscriptions are an early form of Hebrew. However, he has arrived at different interpretations than David Roll. Petrovich identifies words and names he believes are uniquely Hebrew, as well as biblical characters. One such character had a son who participated in the building of the tabernacle at Mount Sinai. In another inscription from the mines of Sirabit al-Qadim, he even reads the name Moses. What makes interpreting these inscriptions so difficult is that there are only consonants, no vowels. Many of them have no spaces between words. They can be written either left to right or right to left. The true identification of several of the letters are disputed, and many are damaged, making them hard to read. That is why many scholars state we can't read these inscriptions as Hebrew.
Someone's attempt to state that they can not only read these inscriptions, but read names that we know from the Bible, or posit that we have people present in these inscriptions from the Bible. It's a difficult thing indeed. You have to have evidence for these proposals, and it's just not there.
Some of my critics, such as Christopher Rolston, are saying that this could be any Semitic language. There's no way of identifying it as clearly being Hebrew. There are several distinctively Hebrew words that are not found in any other Semitic language that are contained in the 15 Hebrew inscriptions that I've translated.
The key to Petrovich's approach was to test different letter identifications for those Proto-Sinaitic letters that are disputed.
I was able to try the different options of what all the scholars have been proposing for 100 years or so. And through that process, I was able to answer which were correct, because in certain contexts, if you took it one way, it wouldn't work. If you took it another way, it definitely worked. In fact, it always worked.
When Roll and Petrovich assigned equivalent Hebrew letters to these inscriptions, they claim they make sense when read as Hebrew. They state they are finding uniquely Hebrew words. They also claim that some of the inscriptions reference biblical characters and events. What complicates this issue is that their different approaches in reading the letters produce different interpretations. But at the end of the day, it's encouraging that there are at least two possibilities that result in meaningful phrases for these inscriptions when Hebrew letters are applied. What these inscriptions might say is something I will continue to investigate in future films.
People such as Professor Rolston say that it can't be Hebrew because the Hebrew writing didn't exist until much later in time.
That's true. He calls this language Northwest Semitic. These inscriptions are Northwest Semitic. But I say it's a matter of history, not a matter of language. You can interpret them as Hebrew only if you have the history to back it up.
Because we have a script that looks similar to Hebrew, yet has some uncertainties with the interpretations, the final step becomes the key to determining which Semitic group invented it. Does the history of the early alphabet match the history of the Israelites? The hieroglyphic roots of the first alphabet, along with the locations of the inscriptions, point to Egypt being the source. Most scholars believe that this first alphabet developed out of the elite class of scribes who would have been familiar with using Egyptian hieroglyphs. But Professor Goldwasser has a different idea.
Your theory is that common people invented the alphabet.
Yeah. My theory is that I take this great invention that changed history from the intelligentsia of the old world to the so-called simple people, and say my inventor or inventors were just people that were illiterate in any script, and this gave them the freedom to invent, you see, because their mind was free. Nothing was told them you should do this with this picture and that with that. They could prepare a new theory. People hate it. The scholars today even hate it.
They hate it?
Yeah.
How
They
dare they?
still write against me. It's impossible that simple people invented this very complex, phonetical, and you know, it's common sense. It's fantastic common sense.
Everyone agrees that whether they were elite or from the common class, whoever invented this Semitic alphabet had to have been a genius. But who would have had the motive to write their Semitic language in this unique script?
The book of Genesis tells us that the first descendant of Abraham to arrive in Egypt was his great-grandson, Joseph, the son of Jacob. Joseph's brothers had sold him as a slave to a caravan of traders who brought him down to Egypt. With God's help, Joseph was able to save Egypt by warning of a coming calamity. 7 years of plenty would be followed by 7 years of terrible famine. Pharaoh is so impressed that he puts Joseph in charge of preparing for the famine and makes him second in command over the entire country. Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are.
So Joseph was an administrator over all of Egypt, a position that would have required him to read and write hieroglyphics.
Could your distant relatives, the Israelites, or let's say Joseph, Could they have been involved with any of this writing?
I can write another story
Okay.
about somebody called
Benny.
Benny, who was also in Egypt,
Yeah.
and he was also very clever,
Hmm.
and he saw the hieroglyphs, and he might have invented the alphabet. So this is endless, you see. First of all, it's a little too late already. Then how come the inscriptions in Sarah Bit el-Khadem are earlier than
Yeah.
your time of Joseph or Benny or whoever it
Whoever,
would
yeah.
be?
Professor Goldwasser is assuming that these inscriptions are earlier than the time of Joseph because she holds to the standard view of the Ramesses Exodus. However, my previous investigation had uncovered impressive archaeological finds matching Joseph and his family in the Middle Kingdom. These all came from a location called Avaris, the city beneath Ramesses, where the Bible places the early Israelites. It was David Rohl who had first come up with these connections. Could there be more that tied these inscriptions to the biblical story? The location where the Petries found the first Proto-Sinaitic script was in the desolate area of Sirabit el-Qadim in the Sinai Peninsula. These were Egyptian mines where seasonal expeditions from Egypt would come to extract copper and turquoise. Inscriptions at the Sinai mining site indicated that the expeditions seemed to have originated from the area of Avaris. Professor Redford surprised me when he stated he saw a connection between this early alphabet and the city of Avaris, only from a slightly later period.
I have a strong suspicion that the alphabet that we're talking about, that is the West Semitic alphabet, was a hallmark of the Hyksos writing system. I really believe that, and I fully expect someday, going out on a limb here, someday to find inscriptions of this sort at Avaris.
Oh, really?
Yes, or elsewhere in the Delta.
Although skeptical of the biblical story, Professor Redford connecting this script to Avaris is significant, because that would mean that if the Israelites lived in Avaris during the Middle Kingdom, that city could have been the epicenter for both the early Israelites and the early alphabet.
Joseph saves the country from a terrible famine, enables his father Jacob and his entire family to settle in the best part of the land, a place called Goshen.
Is there any indication of famines in Egypt?
Of course there is, in many different periods. But there's one key period when we get this massive famine, which lasts about 7 to 10 years. And it's the time of the end of the 12th dynasty, in the reign of Amenemhat III. He's the pharaoh of this big famine.
The reign of Amenemhat III exactly matches the time of Joseph in the early pattern. And it was amazing to see how specific the connection was between Amenemhat, Joseph, and the dates of the two oldest alphabetic inscriptions in Sinai.
This is the image of the oldest fully Hebrew inscription. There are the letters. Here they are drawn in. Here's another image showing you Sinai 377 here in the form of a stela form. So it's like a tombstone, right? It's rounded at the top and goes down straight on either side. And it's intricately connected to another inscription. This is Sinai 46 to its left.
Are these both, in other words, this is one inscription and then this is a second one, but
Exactly.
they're on the same rock face?
On the same rock face. We have Sinai 377 and Sinai 46. Sinai 377 being in Hebrew, very short, very trite inscription, and Sinai 46, Middle Egyptian inscription, with the year date at the top, and then it reads right to left in these two rows, and then in all of these columns going down. The date on here is year 20 of Amenemhat III, 1840 BC, 12th dynasty. So that connects these two inscriptions in time.
To the time of Joseph and his family.
And it's, yes, the time of Joseph.
The question is, are the inscriptions that were discovered in southern Egypt from the same time period as those found in the Sinai Peninsula?
The last inscription we looked at was Sinai 377, which dates to year 20 of Amenemhat III. This is Wadi al-Hol inscription 2, which dates to year 26 of Amenemhat III, the same ruler. So we're seeing inscriptions one after another, all from the same time period, showing a connection.
In Central Egypt, at the site of Lahoun, Flinders Petrie made one more stunning discovery. He uncovered a pyramid builder compound. There, he found fragments of pottery from the Middle Kingdom with unique markings he called pot marks, which he felt were experimentations with the new alphabet. Then he found an amazing inscription that included both Egyptian hieroglyphic and Semitic writing, and it had a date on it, year 29. There were only 2 Middle Kingdom pharaohs from this period who could record a reign of at least 29 years, Amenemhat III and his father, Senuseret III, who according to the early pattern were reigning together at the time of Joseph's famine. Petrovich notes that in the period when they ruled together, Amenemhat's years were the ones recorded on monuments, so this inscription must pertain to his reign. The inscription from Lahoun contained unique style markers that matched the other Semitic inscriptions from Wadi al-Hol and the Sinai mining area. What this indicates is that the 5 oldest alphabetic inscriptions that can be dated all emerged in the Middle Kingdom during the reign of Amenemhat III and in a narrow 11-year window, exactly where the pattern that David Rohl identified places Joseph and his family.
Who do you think actually was the inspiration for this alphabet?
I think it has to be Joseph. That would be my guess, because of what he was. He was the vizier of Egypt. He was the most important man in Egypt after the pharaoh. He was educated. He worked in the palace. He was running the country virtually. So what better person to invent the Hebrew alphabet than the person who was familiar with the hieroglyphs, who knew the Semitic people, who was administering the land? He's the guy who's most likely to be able to come up with this idea.
So who invented the first alphabet? As scholars suggest, it may have been an elite scribe or a common miner like Benny. But whoever it was, they would have needed to be a Semite, familiar with hieroglyphics, motivated to create a new script, while living in Egypt at the same time as Pharaoh Amenemhat III and Joseph.
If Joseph, for instance, was the person who invented this method of writing the Semitic language as a script, Moses would have learnt that very easily, and that would have been the form of writing that he would use to write the narrative of the Exodus journey.
But even if Moses was an early adopter of this new technology, could he have written 5 whole books of the Torah while in the wilderness?
Just imagine, he's got 40 years in the desert during a time of wilderness wanderings. If I had 40 years in the desert with some grumbling people, I think I could produce more than the equivalent of what's in a Torah. I think you could too. In 1 year, how many emails do you write? You know, you write hundreds, if not thousands of emails. And imagine if you don't have any other technology or anything else to do, what are you going to do? You know, you could easily write the Torah. And a guy with Moses' background, his education, he grew up in the best schools of Pharaoh. He had a knowledge of Mesopotamia. He had a knowledge of Egyptian culture. He had a knowledge of his own culture. He knew the oral traditions. Who would have been more qualified to produce a document like this than a guy like Moses, who had the best education and a whole bunch of time?
So with Moses' background as both Prince of Egypt and an Israelite, he would have most likely known about the Proto-Sinaitic script that the Petries later discovered. But there's another piece of information that both Rohl and Petrovich see, connecting the history of the Proto-Sinaitic script and the history of the Israelites. They note that these types of inscriptions end in Egypt around the time of the Exodus and are never seen there again. However, inscriptions in the Proto-Sinaitic style do show up afterwards in Canaan. That is why one of the names of the script is Proto-Canaanite. This just happens to match the Bible's account of the Israelites, who grew into a nation in Egypt and later moved to Canaan, conquering the Promised Land. Supporting the idea that the mystery script is actually Hebrew and not Phoenician is the fact that when the inscriptions first show up in the area of Canaan, they are actually found in Israel for several hundred years before showing up in Phoenicia. The Bible records that the greatest interaction between Israel and Phoenicia, which is the area of Lebanon, was during the reign of King Solomon in the 10th century BC. Solomon was given the responsibility of building Israel's first temple in Jerusalem. To help with this task, Solomon wrote to King Hiram, obtaining cedar trees of Lebanon and craftsmen. Intriguingly, the oldest known alphabetic inscription from the land of Phoenicia is found on the lid of a sarcophagus of a king named Ahiram. Many date this artifact to the 10th century BC. I took note that the Bible's King Hiram at the time of Solomon is virtually the same name as Ahiram on the sarcophagus. Could it be that the writing system of the Israelites was shared with the Phoenicians at this very time, when the scripts were indistinguishable, and we find the first inscriptions in Phoenicia? Just as Epolamus has stated that Moses imparted grammar to the Jews, and that the Phoenicians received it from the Jews. When looking at the final step for whether these inscriptions could be Hebrew, the history of this script does match the history of the Israelites, but only if you use the earlier Exodus date. The inventor of the script was a Semitic genius who was familiar with Egyptian hieroglyphs, matching the Bible's account of Joseph's rise to power in Egypt. This script seems to have some connection with Avaris, the location in the Nile Delta where the Bible places the Israelites. The script first shows up in a very narrow window of time during the reign of Amenemhat III, exactly where the early pattern puts Joseph and his family. The script migrates to Canaan, matching the Israelites' journey to the Promised Land. The first inscriptions are found in ancient Israel, not Phoenicia. And curiously, the first inscriptions to show up in Phoenicia are found on the sarcophagus of a king called Ahiram at the time of Solomon. If one considers that the Bible might actually be giving a true account, can there be any better candidates for the ones responsible for this script than the early Israelites? They would have had the motive and ability to develop it in time to write the first books of the Bible. So when people see a connection between the Proto-Sinaitic or the Proto-Canaanite scripts and Hebrew, what do you say?
I say that what I call science and what my teacher taught me,
Professor Nave?
Nave,
Yeah.
would say that it's a very bad, misleading mistake, and that the person that writes it has, of course, an agenda.
On the surface, mainstream scholars use linguistic arguments to dismiss this idea. But there may be a deeper reason involved. What time do you think that the Exodus would have happened then?
Most people put the Exodus in the 13th century BCE. From my perspective, based on the data at hand, this continues to be the most convincing proposal.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to believe in a historical Moses, he would have to have lived in the 13th century. Whatever it was that happened in the Exodus period, it happened in the 13th century, not the 15th.
Something that strikes me as ironic is that many mainstream scholars say that the Exodus that didn't happen had to have happened in the 13th century BC, at the time of Pharaoh Ramesses, where there's little to no evidence. I was stumped by this problem while making my earlier film, until I was shown the earlier pattern of evidence. It seems this same issue is at play with the early alphabet.
If you're saying basically that Moses and Joseph were actually later in time than when this script was invented for the first time, then somebody other than Hebrews or Israelites must have invented it. It couldn't have been them.
The late Thomas Kuhn was a physicist, historian, and philosopher of science. He talked about paradigms in the world of science. A paradigm is a pattern of thinking, a model, or school of thought that everyone in a particular field of study holds to, and the world of archaeology has its paradigms. A paradigm is based on a set of presuppositions, things that are assumed to be true, and we all have them. In the case of mainstream scholarship, their paradigm for the early books of the Bible not being purely historical seems to be largely based on the key presupposition that an exodus happened at the time of Ramesses. It puts the Israelites too late in time to be connected with the invention of the Proto-Sinaitic script, which results in the conclusion that the Bible is an untrustworthy oral tradition. Paradigms can blind all of us from seeing the possibility of something new or different. But what if the presuppositions on which those paradigms are based are faulty? In fact, Thomas Kuhn said that science doesn't progress with a gradual accumulation of knowledge, but instead undergoes periodic revolutions or paradigm shifts when some new idea abruptly transforms the views of that particular field. If it was established that the world's oldest alphabet was Hebrew, and that Moses did, in fact, use it to write the Torah, that would change how the world views the Exodus, the Bible, and world history. But to do so would require a major paradigm shift. This brings me back to Flinders Petrie.
Petrie is often known as the father of archaeology. The techniques that he introduced and his understanding and recognition of the importance of gathering all objects, that applies to archaeology anywhere.
Petrie also had a startling realization of what this mysterious script in the Sinai meant for the writing of the Bible.
Here we have the result. At a date some 5 centuries before the oldest Phoenician writing that is known. It finally disproves the hypothesis that the early Israelites, who came through this region into Egypt and passed back again, could not have used writing.
If the father of Egyptian archaeology is telling us that the Israelites had the ability to write 500 years before the Phoenicians, what has changed since then? Is the main change the paradigm of a generation that became skeptical of the Bible because the Ramesses Exodus theory placed the Exodus at a time when there was little to no evidence to support it? I have now found evidence for all the steps of the original pattern. The script appears by the time of the Exodus. It did not arise in another part of the world like Greece, Persia, India, or China. It originated in the region of Egypt and the Sinai, where the Bible places the early Israelites. This script is the earliest known alphabet which was needed to write the Torah. Because it was a Semitic alphabet, it was a form of writing like Hebrew. This is all Moses would have needed to write the basic form of the Exodus account. In fact, I emailed Professor Rolston and asked him, for the sake of argument, If Moses was responsible for writing at least part of the Torah, in your view, could the Proto-Sinaitic script have been used to perform this task? Rolston replied, yes, the script that Moses could have used or would have been early alphabetic, not Old Hebrew. By the way, I believe that Moses was historical and that he was literate. And speaking of literacy, the use of a simple alphabet would have allowed the Israelite people, young and old, to read it, understand it, and preserve the words given by God at Mount Sinai for generations to come. Finally, the evidence from all three steps of the Hebrew pattern also show that it could actually be Hebrew. The letters match the look of Hebrew. Some have interpreted the inscriptions as readable Hebrew. And the history of the script matches the history of the Israelites. There seems to be no reason to doubt that Moses could have written the Exodus account as the Bible claims. Egyptologist Alan Gardner, the man who determined these inscriptions were the oldest known alphabet, came to an insightful observation about its origin.
It has been universally recognized that so simple and therefore so perfect an instrument for the visible recording of language could not conceivably have resulted from one spontaneous effort of genius.
The alphabet certainly was genius. Yet, as a person of faith, I wonder, what if the invention of the alphabet did not ultimately have a human source? Because with no alphabet, you would have no Bible. And the evidence appears to show that this script did emerge suddenly in a very narrow window of time. The Bible states that it was itself divinely inspired. Could it be that the genius of the alphabet was also a divinely inspired gift from God, given to a particular people at a particular time, in preparation for what was to come? The prime purpose of communicating the words of God to mankind, beginning at Mount Sinai.
There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." And God spoke all these words, saying, "I am the Lord, I am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." You shall have no other gods besides me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. You shall not bow to them or serve them, You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet anything that is your neighbor's. And he gave to Moses the 2 tablets of the testimony, written with the finger of God. In the 2nd year, the cloud lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony, and the people of Israel set out by stages from the wilderness of Sinai. The law was given to instruct them how they were to live. When the people repeatedly rebelled, it took 40 years before they could enter the land that had been promised to Abraham hundreds of years earlier. And during this time, Moses had written down all the instructions from God, as well as the history of his people, beginning with the creation of the world. When Moses had finished writing the words of this law in a scroll to its very end, Moses commanded the Levites, who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, he said, "Take this book of the law and put it by the side of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God."
I started to think about the fact that words have meaning. And in order to preserve their meaning over time, some form of writing was needed. We all take it for granted today, but where did it come from? Before the alphabet, only the elite had this gift of knowledge. But then all that changed. Now everyone had the ability to read with this simple alphabet. And this technology hasn't been replaced in nearly 4,000 years. So I continue to wonder, was the alphabet's arrival at this time in history just a coincidence? Or was it the gift necessary to retain the knowledge of God?